We spent a month over Christmas in 1992 staying with friends in Cameroon. After several months on the road, it was lovely to stay put in one place, to put down roots and get to know people and to be in a Christian community. And then in January of 93, we set off again, heading east. We drove for 5 days on hard-packed gravel roads through the Cameroon and Central African Republic. We stopped in Bangui to get our visas for Zaire, and then we arrived in Bangassou, 2,000 kilometres of travel. Over 5 days we were tired. We stayed a couple of days in Bangassou, washing our clothes, talking to travellers, trying to find out about the condition of the roads as we travelled on. We were on the banks of the mighty Zaire River, the Congo River, preparing to cross over into Zaire. When we were back in the UK preparing for the trip, we knew that the two big challenges for us were linking up North Africa and West Africa, crossing the Sahara, and we'd already encountered this, and then linking up West Africa with East Africa, travelling through the mighty rainforests of equatorial Africa, Zaire in particular. We also knew that there were challenges in terms of politics. People had told us that this was the worst possible time to cross Africa. Now I've got about 100 books on Africa on our bookshelves, and as I read them, some of the most difficult books to read are the books about Zaire. This is a country that's the biggest geographical country in Africa. It's the size of Western Europe. People consider it to be the wealthiest country in the world in terms of natural resources, and yet it's a nation that has been ruthlessly exploited by so many nations and so many people. And as I've read history books, I realise that nobody really seems to come out of history with any honour when it comes to Zaire. Whether it's the Belgians, when it was a time of being a Belgian colony, whether it's the British during the time of slavery, whether it's America in recent history in their backing of President Mobutu, in the assassination of Lumumba, the first elected Prime Minister, an armed coup. And for 30 years, Mobutu had been propped up in power during the time of the Cold War. And when we arrived there in 1993, Mobutu was still in power, deeply unpopular in many parts of the country, yet clinging on to power, using the military to back him up. It was a time of economic hardship. Over 3 years there had been massive devaluation of the currency. The Zaireans had gone from 20 to a single dollar 3 years earlier to 2.5 million to $1 3 years later. And Mobutu had been printing 5 million Zaireans notes to pay the army. The local shopkeepers had not been accepting this money, and the army were mutinying. There were riots in the capital, Kinshasa. As we listened to our shortwave radio every night and listened to the focus on Africa and listened to what was lying ahead of us, we heard with nervousness what was happening in the capital. We heard that 1,000 people had been killed. We heard that the French ambassador had actually been shot while he was on his balcony looking at the riots. We heard that French Marines had landed in the capital and were evacuating French nationals, that the Belgian army was in the Congo-Brazzaville preparing to evacuate Belgians. And so there we were, on the banks of the Zaire River, preparing to cross over into Zaire. And so this story really is about God's protection. As we prepared to cross, we didn't know what we were heading into. We knew that there was really no way around Zaire. We couldn't ship our vehicles around the problem. We were in the heart of Africa, right in the middle of Africa. We could potentially drive and stay north of Zaire, but that would mean cutting through the southern part of Sudan, where there were also been years of civil war. And so there we were, preparing to cross the river into Zaire. We crossed the Zaire River on a pirogue. 2 of us heading over with a jerry can of fuel, and we gave the jerry can of fuel to the pilot of the ferry, which was moored on the other side of the river. He filled up his tank with our fuel, crossed over, picked us up and drove us back to the other side, and we started out into Zaire. For the next 12 days we were on mud roads crossing through some of the toughest terrain that we'd ever experienced. In our minds, the biggest challenge for us was police, soldiers, roadblocks. We were apprehensive, we were praying constantly, we were praying morning and night. And amazingly, it felt like we were hidden away, we were isolated. For the first 3 days we did not see a single vehicle, we didn't see any police on the roads. We only saw 10 expats, 10 foreigners in our whole 12 days in Zaire, and they were all Catholic priests. We hardly saw any soldiers. We had far more problems at roadblocks in places like Cameroon and Nigeria and Algeria, where daily we were being stopped by roadblocks, where we often had soldiers leaning through the window with a machine gun, where we were being constantly pushed for bribes. But in Zaire, in a strange way, it felt like we were hidden. We were crossing quietly through the northeast of the country. Kinshasa was over 1,500 kilometres away. It felt like we were hidden away. There was a strange oppressiveness to the days in that we were driving through rainforest. We had very little view. We were closed in on all sides. The road was in terrible condition. It was a mud road. And yet, in the same way, that oppressive closed-inness seemed to shield us and hide us away. And we realised that God had protected us. I realised that many other people in the country did go through very difficult times then and in the years to come. But we were preserved as we drove through, and we were very grateful for that. And so, interestingly, what was the challenge for us was the soldiers actually wasn't a challenge. The real challenge was the condition of the road, the infrastructure, the challenges of driving. On the ferry, as we crossed over, we met a Catholic priest. He gave us a bag of supplies and asked us to drop it off at a Catholic mission 3 hours drive away. The next day we arrived at that mission and we gave the bag of food to some nuns there. They gave us some more food to pass on to another Catholic mission. And over the 12 days we stopped at 3 or 4 different missions. They were the only foreigners we met in the country, mostly Belgians and French. On one of these Catholic missions we met 3 lovely men. They were all Belgian. One of them was in his 70s. He had this ancient, long, white, flowing goatee. He'd been there 55 years. There was a second man who'd been there 50 years, I think. He was in his late 60s. He'd been there since he was a young man. He had a kind of middle-length goatee. And there was a young man in 30s. They jokingly said he was the new man. He'd been there 15 years already. He had a reasonable-sized goatee. It was lovely to see people like this who had given their lives to serving in some of the most isolated places imaginable. As we drove each day, we discovered that the real challenge was the road. We had 4 or 5 big thunderstorms. The road was wet. It was mud. We got stuck in the mud numerous times. Fortunately, we had a winch and we were able to pull the vehicle out. We had a puncture or 2 punctures. Over those 12 days, I remember keeping account, and we crossed over 137 rivers. Many of those rivers had bridges, but those bridges were simply logs that had been felled, 5-metre long crossings and 2 logs spaced 5 or 6 feet apart, and 2 of us would stand on the logs in front of the Land Rover and beckon so the driver could see whether to inch slightly to the left or the right, and we had to carefully inch the Land Rovers across these crossings. Some of the rivers we had to drive down the bank and forward and drive out the other side. The most challenging bridge, I remember, was 65 metres long. I remember that because we paced it several times as we walked backwards and forwards. It was a disused railway. It had 2 railway tracks crossing the bridge, but over time people had taken out all the railway sleepers and there were lots of gaps. There was no way you could drive across it safely. And so we had to inch across this bridge, foot by foot, moving vehicles from the left, from the back of the vehicle to the front of the vehicle. We had 2 pieces of pierced steel planking, which we'd brought specially for this, and we moved them from the back wheels to the front wheels and slowly drove across on a platform of our own making. It took an hour to cross this bridge. That day, I think we managed to drive 50 miles in 10 hours of driving, what with crossing bridges and getting stuck in the mud. Each night we stopped. There wasn't much flat ground where there wasn't trees, and so we would generally park in the road, which was just 6 foot wide. We strung up ropes between our 2 Land Rovers and we hung our mosquito nets, and we slept there in the road. We built a big fire. Often people would come out of the forest and sit with us in the evenings. Most of them didn't speak French, so we weren't able to communicate, but we had medicines, we had drugs, we gave people medicines, we treated people for some ulcers and cuts. Our money wasn't much use there. People didn't want the money, and so we bartered. We bought chickens for bars of soap. I remember buying a head of bananas from someone for a pair of Speedos. They weren't mine, by the way. He went away with this pair of Speedos as underwear. And so we travelled slowly through the country. It took us 12 days to cross 1,200 miles or 2,000 kilometres. Slow travel. I remember one day, it was probably the 7th or the 8th day of travel, the 2 Land Rovers had stopped on the edge of the path. I was in the second vehicle. I was sitting in the back seat on the right-hand side. We'd stopped to buy some bananas. It had been a day of heavy rain and the road was slidey and wet and muddy. The driver of my vehicle was behind the other vehicle. He started moving forward slowly, and what he didn't realise was that to the left of the Land Rover ahead there was a deep rut in the road, full of water. And as we inched forward, the left-hand side wheel went into the rut, and it slid in the mud slowly into this quite deep hole. I was sitting in the back seat, and in almost slow motion at probably 2 miles an hour, the centre of gravity of the vehicle slowly reached an unnerving angle as we slid further into this hole, and then we tipped onto our side. Thankfully, the windows were wide open so they didn't smash on the ground. Thankfully, nobody had their arms leaning out the window, but we ended up lying on our side with our faces in the mud, books falling on top of us, pillows, torches, radios. In that split second, I thought it was a disaster. I imagined that the axles were broken, something had happened to the vehicle. We climbed out of the windows above us. I could see the light up ahead. We climbed out, the four of us. The other vehicle had stopped and they were running back to us. We got out of the vehicle. We emptied some of the things out of the vehicle. Fortunately, Joshua, the vehicle with a winch, was the vehicle ahead. So Caleb was lying in disgrace on its side in the mud, and we reversed Joshua around. We unwound the winch. We put it around a tree to act as a fulcrum, a pulley, and then we tied it onto the roof rack, onto the exterior roll cage of the Land Rover, and slowly we inched this vehicle back up onto its four wheels. Amazingly, within half an hour of it tipping over, we had it back on its wheels. I'd heard the crack of glass as it hit the ground, but fortunately it was just the wing mirror broken. There was a couple of dents in the side doors, and we straightened those out when we took the panels off later that night and managed to smooth it out. There was no damage at all to the Land Rovers. We'd been really preserved. We were very thankful because we'd got into the bad habit of quite often one or even two people sitting on the bumper of the Land Rover as we were driving through Zaire. Our speed was so low, we were rarely doing more than 10, 15 miles an hour. We were stopping so often to cross bridges. Whenever we reached a deep rut or a hole full with water, one of us would get out, we'd wade through the water to check how deep it was, to make sure it was safe for the Land Rovers to drive through. And so we'd been sitting on the front of the bonnet for speed. Fortunately, at that point when we tipped over, everybody was inside the vehicles. And so we were protected from harm. There was another time, just as we were about to enter into Zaire, we were driving through the Central African Republic at quite a high speed on the good road. We had a large wooden plywood box on our roof where we stored things, and the wind somehow caught the box and it actually lifted it right off the roof rack and it smashed onto the road behind. We were always travelling in convoy, just 20 or 25 metres between the two vehicles. But thankfully at that point the Land Rover behind had just stopped to take a photo, and so this huge wooden box didn't smash into the Land Rover as it undoubtedly would have done. Times like that we saw God's protection in an amazing way. And so we slowly travelled through Zaire. Inch by inch it felt, some days just managing 50, 60 miles. We travelled through thunderstorms. We slept out at night. We bartered for our food. And after 12 days, we were finally nearing the Ugandan border. We stopped in a beautiful area, the Garamba National Park, which incidentally years later would become the haven for the notorious Lord's Resistance Army. But at that point, it was a relatively safe place to be. There were no tourists there. We spent 3 lovely days in the park. We crossed over a small river on a raft, pulling the Land Rovers across on a chain, drove around the park. There wasn't much game there. It was pretty Spartan, but it was a beautiful area of savannah. We saw some giraffe and elephants and different game. And we just had a time of peace and rest. And it felt like we were hidden away in this corner of Zaire. We were daily praying, we were daily listening to the radio, we were hearing what was happening in other parts of the country, and yet we just seemed to escape it. We seemed to slide quietly through the north of the country. We didn't see a single overland vehicle in those 12 days. We hardly saw any vehicles. We didn't see any tarmac. The only street lights we saw in 12 days were at the Catholic mission in one of the small villages. And so finally we arrived in Uganda. We'd been travelling for 3 weeks since Cameroon. We'd crossed 4,000 kilometres of some of the most difficult terrain, and we'd experienced protection and peace. The anxiety was real. The things that we were hearing from different parts of the country were real. but we'd experienced protection. And I looked back on that time as a time of incredible beauty. I remember driving through one part, and it was mile after mile of huge bamboos covering many, many square miles of land. These bamboos were huge. They were probably the thickness of my thigh. They were 3 or 4 stories high, so looking up at 20 metres of bamboos up above, huge clumps of bamboos growing up high, and the weight of the bamboo, they were bending together and forming these huge Gothic arches. It was like driving through an outdoor cathedral. Some of my favourite photos of the time are the Land Rovers parked under these huge arches and the sunlight with the play of light and shadow coming through the bamboos and splayed out over our vehicles underneath. It was a place of incredible beauty, of massive nation, challenging infrastructure, incredibly friendly people, sacrificial Catholics serving in very difficult places. And we saw God's protection and God's provision in beautiful ways as we travelled through there. And we arrived in Uganda eager to be back in an English-speaking country, moving from driving on the right-hand side of the road to the left-hand side of the road, and happy to be back on tarmac again after some incredible journeys.